Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at today's top stories. President Biden today touts plans to tackle inflation while attacking what he now calls the GOP's ultra-MAGA agenda. How did he clash with a Republican senator who's calling for the president to resign? Congress this week is on track to pass a $40 billion aid package to help Ukraine, and there's a growing bipartisan call to blacklist Russia. Some in Congress want to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror. What is the White House's response? Kelly Lester, director of outreach at ProLove Ministries, had multiple abortions and worked at an abortion clinic. She joins us to discuss her change of heart and her newfound path on her journey to becoming pro-life. Renewing his pledge to fight inflation, President Biden today sharpens his midterm message and takes on what he calls the ultra-MAGA agenda. But Republicans were quick to fire back. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
I want every American to know that I'm taking inflation very seriously.
President Biden is renewing his pledge to fight inflation. This as gas prices hit a fresh all-time high of $4.37 a gallon, according to a Tuesday report by AAA. And the president is blaming two things.
There's a once-in-a-century pandemic. A second cause, Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine.
And while touting his own plan, Biden is sharpening his attack on Republican plans, which he calls
it's the ultra-MAGA agenda, their extreme agenda. Look at their agenda.
He's accusing Republican proposals, in particular one by Senator Rick Scott, of trying to raise taxes on working families.
Americans have a choice right now between two paths, reflecting two very different sets of values.
And that surely does not only refer to economic policies. Here's the White House on Biden's ultra-MAGA reference today.
And it's also the obsession with culture wars and wars against Mickey Mouse and banning books. President thinks that's extreme. And so to him, adding a little ultra to it, give it a little extra pop.
Republicans, meanwhile, are quick to fire back.
Democrats' policies have unleashed the worst inflation in more than 40 years.
And Senator Scott calls Biden's comments lies, releasing a statement saying the most effective thing Joe Biden can do to solve the inflation crisis he created is resign. Meanwhile, as part of his plan to ease inflation, Biden says he's weighing cuts to tariffs on China.
Will you drop former President Trump's China tariffs?
We're discussing that right now.
And we are going to see the latest inflation numbers as soon as Wednesday morning when the Labor Department releases the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, for April. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was part of a tense discussion over a potential abortion ban today at a Senate hearing. Yellen said overturning Roe v. Wade would have damaging effects on the economy. But Republican Senator Tim Scott called her answer harsh. Here's the exchange.
Well, I believe that eliminating the right of women to make decisions about when and whether to have children would have very damaging effects on the economy and would set women back decades.
To make it sound like it's just another 0.4% added to our labor force participation as a result of the issue of abortion, just to me, seems harsh.
Well, I certainly do.
I'll just simply say that as a guy raised by a black woman in abject poverty, I'm thankful to be here as United States Senator first.
There's a bipartisan call in Congress to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror. Today, two senators suggested even slapping this onto their soon-to-pass $40 billion bill to aid Ukraine. NTD's Melina Wisecup has the details.
Congress is on track this week to send more money to help Ukraine. $40 billion on the House agenda to pass tonight.
And we dare not relent or delay swift action to help our friends in need.
The $40 billion will fund security, weapons, and humanitarian assistance. This is in addition to the $14 billion already passed in March.
Putin losing to me is priceless.
Senator Graham, along with the Democrat senator, want to go further. Today, they're urging congressional leadership to attach to this billion-dollar aid package a measure to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror.
And it will put Russia outside the pale of civilized nations.
President Zelensky asked Biden to take the step a few weeks ago, but so far the White House has slow-walked that request. The White House says the U.S. has already used maximum efforts to hold Russia accountable.
Extensive financial sanctions, export controls.
But the senators say blacklisting Russia carries a heavy-weighted message.
To the Russian people, change course, because if you stay with Putin, it's going to be a miserable existence for the Russian people.
So, Melina, these senators who are pushing back to blacklist Russia say it's the moral approach to take here. With that being said, we know the Chinese Communist Party has for decades been harming its own people through persecution. We know they're involved in state-sponsored live forced organ harvesting. They've also threatened the sovereignty of Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. Do you think these senators here could also consider designating China as a sponsor of terror at some point?
Steve, this is the exact question that we asked Senators Blumenthal and Graham. They said that these concerns about China are valid, but they quickly shifted the focus back to Russia. Here's a bit of that exchange. We know they're persecuting people of faith. There's evidence of them doing forced organ harvesting. Would this not be enough to also label them as a state-sponsored of terror?
Well, we're focused on Russia because Russia has taken the international order and turned it upside down. The abuses you described in China, I think, are real. But if China went into Taiwan, I hope they understand what comes their way, right?
And if we act to put Russia in this club, it will be another deterrent to China.
And to be clear, an invasion does not have to happen in order to designate a country as a state sponsor of terror. So we asked the senators after that press conference, we asked them what's holding them back from taking action to hold China accountable for all of the inhumane actions that they've taken against their own people over the years. Senator Graham told me that right now, politically, their focus is on Russia. Steve, back to you.
NTD's Melina Wisecup reporting from the nation's capital. And China and Russia are now both blocked from attending a major international naval conference in Sydney, Australia. In the past, China was always invited, but this year, Australia's Vice Admiral of the Royal Australian Navy cited deteriorating relations as the reason to not invite these Chinese leaders. Pro-abortion protesters are pushing First Amendment rights, while state and federal officials vow to increase security for Supreme Court justices. Protesters have been gathering outside the homes of 6 Republican-appointed justices in what appears to be an attempt to influence an upcoming decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The Senate quickly moved to pass a bill for the security and protection of Supreme Court justices and their immediate family members. Virginia and Maryland state officials are also guaranteeing the safety of the justices. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin and the office of Maryland Governor Larry Hogan said on Monday their state police are coordinating with federal authorities to ensure there is no violence outside the homes of the Supreme Court justices. Pro-abortion activists continue to protest outside of the homes of these Supreme Court justices. This is despite a federal law that says individuals may not picket or parade near a residence occupied by a judge in an attempt to influence him or her. The Department of Justice has remained silent on this issue. The debate over abortion will continue to rage on, but in the meantime, it's going to be important to see through the talking points and the emotional rhetoric. Our next guest is Director of Outreach at ProLove Ministries and knows very well about the abortion issue from multiple perspectives. Kelly Lester, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Kelly, if you could just briefly set the table for us. You are not always pro-life. From what I understand, you even worked at an abortion clinic. You've also had multiple abortions over the course of your life that you've spoken about. I think you can speak to this topic from a very unique perspective. How did you make this shift?
Sure. So I, like many people, found myself pregnant and at 15 had my first abortion. I then later on had several more abortions. I even did work at the clinic where I had my first abortion. So you're right. I have been on all aspects of this debate, both as a worker, as a client, someone who has stood outside of abortion facilities trying to help women, and now working with a ministry that helps get pro-life legislation passed, as well as helps former workers and provides resources for women that were like myself so that they can choose life.
So from your experiences being in and around these clinics, both as a patient and as a, an employee, are there any signs, literally, that they post there or attempts to help these young women who go into these clinics to potentially be talked out of these abortions, whether it be suggesting adoption or other things, from your experience?
Yeah, and I can speak from my experience. I'm sure that it is not 100% this way at 100 locations, but the overwhelming amount of locations, the resources that are given is at the bottom of your consent form that you sign. It says, if you would like information about parenting or adoption, let us know. It is not something that's discussed at length. It's not like, hey, these are your choices. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what's best for you. It's none of that. We were told in the clinic that when a woman came to the clinic, we needed to assume that abortion was her best option. And we needed to do everything to try to convince her that that was indeed her best option. And that included things like editing magazines so that there weren't pictures of happy couples or families or anything that might convince her to have a child or rise up that maternal instinct in her. And so we did everything to try to convince her that abortion was her best option. And that's what we've heard across the board from the over 600 workers that we've had leave the industry, that in fact, if you start convincing women for options other than abortion, you get let go because you are messing up their bottom line, which is making money from abortions.
Wow, Kelly, we're seeing some of these protests now taking place at the Supreme Court justices' private residences. The mainstream media and even the White House has fallen short of condemning these, even though this is in fact in violation of federal law to harass a judge in an attempt to have them reverse their decision. Sometimes when you have the loudest voice, you can give the impression that you have the majority of public opinion. Mm-hmm. With that said, how popular do you think that the pro-life movement is right now as we speak?
Well, I think that that's kind of a hard statement to qualify or quantify, because if you ask people, for instance, are you in support of Roe versus Wade? There have been many people that have done that, and overwhelmingly, like 80% will say, yes, I support Roe versus Wade. But if you ask them, what does Roe versus Wade do? What does it mean? The overwhelming majority of them do not know what it means. And of that overwhelming majority, if you explain to them what Roe versus Wade actually does, they change their mind and say that they don't support it. I have found the same thing with people when you ask them, are they pro-choice? To be honest with you, I am pro-choice. I am for choices. I am not pro-abortion. And so when you start asking people, what does that mean to you? When you say you're pro-choice, what does that mean? And you find out many times they don't know what that means. They know the narrative that they've been fed, and it sounds good on the outside, but when they get into the realities of it, they don't actually support it. And so I think that the majority of the population, that's how they believe. They want there to be some restrictions at a bare minimum on abortion. They want there to be some guidelines and procedures that are followed. And if they knew the reality of what was actually happening across our country, most of them would say that they do not support it.
What do you say to those who say that this is a step back for women's rights, my body, my choice?
Well, I'd say a lot of things. First off, I would say it's not your body. It's someone else's body. But let's talk about the women's rights thing. I am a mother. I have 6 children. I also work for one of the largest nonprofit organizations and ministries in the country. I also serve at my church. So women are stronger than the abortion industry is telling them they are. And women's rights, when we begin killing our children, and when we begin saying to women that you are not strong enough, you are not smart enough, you are not capable enough to parent or to continue this pregnancy, and you need abortion, we are actually taking a step back. and telling women that they are not good enough. And not only that, but then you look at these companies lately that like Apple and Amazon, Citibank, that are paying for women to travel out of state so that they can get abortions. They're also paying for childcare for their children at home. They are not doing this same thing for women that are choosing to parent. Why is that? Why are they paying for abortions but not providing childcare for women that choose to parent? It's because it's not about women's rights. It's about controlling the narrative and actually controlling women's bodies.
Kelly Lester, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Republicans are taking another hit on Mickey Mouse. Senator Josh Hawley today introduced a bill to take away copyright protections from Disney. As the battle against communist infiltration heats up in the United States, we speak to a candidate in the Oregon race for governor to find out what direction that state is heading in. Governor DeSantis signed a bill to honor victims of communism. He says a lot of young people don't really know what communism is in practice and what it continues to mean around the world today. We'll give you the story. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Republicans are taking more action against Disney. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri introduced a bill today to strip Disney of copyright protections. This newly introduced act would limit copyright material to 56 years. If the law passes, Disney and other companies would immediately lose some copyright protections. Congress passed a copyright law in 1998 due to lobbying from Disney giving corporations ownership for about 100 years. The law was called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. In a press release, Hawley said the age of Republican handouts to big business is over. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill designating November 7th as Victims of Communism Day to honor over 100 million people who suffered under communist oppression. School children would also get a lesson on communism on this day. DeSantis said that college kids idolized communist leaders like Mao Zedong without realizing he was responsible for tens of millions of deaths.
But I think one of the things we've seen is a lot of young people don't really know that much about what communism meant in practice and continues to mean in different parts of the world.
DeSantis was joined by many Hispanic elected officials at Freedom Tower in Miami, where hundreds of thousands of Cubans were received throughout the 1960s as they escaped Fidel Castro's communist regime.
I notice that the people that escape communism for free societies never choose to go back. I don't know very many of them that do that.
Florida has been at the forefront of exposing and cracking down on Marxist underpinnings aimed to subvert traditional American culture and democracy. A state that has really been under siege by such ideologies is the Pacific Northwestern state of Oregon. And our next guest is running to be the next governor of that state. Kerry McQuiston, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. Now, Kerry, you're running for governor of Oregon, a beautiful state, politically a fascinating state, especially when it comes to Portland, what some might call the epicenter or home base for Antifa, a revolutionary group with Marxist roots. Marxism takes on multiple forms. How would you say your agenda combats the seemingly cultural takeover of Marxist ideologies from critical race theory to other things in our society right now?
Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. You know, Brezhnev said that all it took was for them to get hold of one generation of our children, and they would be able to flip us into communism. And that's the push that I'm actually seeing here in Oregon. You know, we have things that blur the lines of how people see themselves, kind of hammer down their individuality. And that's the first step toward communism. You know, these folks have to be a generation convinced that they don't have these individual rights. They may not see themselves as individuals. They have to slide into this hive mentality. And that's absolutely what we're seeing in our education system here in Oregon. You know, it's as if we're the test run here in the United States to see how far they can push this. So I'm absolutely pushing back against it. Part of the platform that I'm running on, for governor, would be to ban critical race theory and some of the other nonsense I'm sure you're seeing in the headlines right now.
Kerry, Governor Ron DeSantis, speaking of socialism and communism, just signed a bill into law mandating that the history of communism be taught in schools throughout Florida. Do you think this is good legislation, and why do you think he did it?
I think it's great legislation. We need to make people aware of this, because I'm completely aware that communism and socialism is how evil manifests itself through our political system, and it will eventually erode and take out Oregon and the United States as a whole if we don't stop it. So I applaud what he's doing. He's pushing back very firmly right now on this push. And we have to have that. We have to have all of our Republican governors almost in a coalition across the United States to push back against this. And I would love to join that coalition.
I think sometimes we tend to forget that communism and joining any communist groups is actually illegal in the United States, yet many of these groups that find refuge in Portland, like Antifa, are in fact communist revolutionaries but just call themselves something else.
Well, absolutely they are. And in Oregon, they have completely gone unchecked under the Kate Brown regime. So the Democrats in our state have actually created this pro-crime agenda, and they've put it out there across Oregon. So we have prisons being knocked down to half capacity under the guise of COVID response. We have prisons that have been closed entirely, and then we have our governor commuting sentences of over 1,000 hardened criminals. And these aren't just lightweights here. These are convicted rapists and murderers she's turning loose out onto the streets. And then you have a DA in Multnomah County, that's where Portland is, that won't prosecute these folks once they're arrested. They're turned around like a revolving door out onto the streets. That absolutely has to stop, and the only way it does is for a Republican governor to get in that position.
Now, you're out on the campaign trail. I'm sure you're meeting real people out there telling you what their concerns are. Is there, a topic or an issue that comes to mind that you're hearing the most from constituents throughout Oregon?
Everything falls under the umbrella of loss of our freedoms and gross mismanagement across the state. And there are so many issues at this point that there isn't just one. We have rampant crime. We have catastrophic wildfires. We have a red carpet rolled out in Oregon for the homeless in every state to come our direction. And then we have a loss of parental rights and education again here in Oregon, which we just kind of touched on a little bit. We have to have the money follow the child to put that power back in the hands of our parents. So there are just so many things, our unhealthy business climate in Oregon. So it's a lot. Our state is on the edge of a cliff right now, and we have to flip it completely right side up again. It's going to take a little bit of work.
Kerry McQuiston, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority has found a new CEO and general manager. The nationwide search has landed Randy Clark with the job. Clark is currently the president of the Metro system in Austin, Texas. Clark will be leaving that position to head DC Metro later this summer. He says he plans to tackle DC Metro's challenges, which include a drop in commuters driven by the pandemic and a change in commuting patterns. Clark also says he and his wife will be taking the Metro service on a daily basis, and that as CEO, he guarantees no one wants safe, reliable, frequent service more than he does. Clark will be replacing current DC Metro head Paul Wiedfeld, who will be retiring next month. And that's all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. Don't forget to visit us at ntd.com/Capitol Report to stay up to date with the latest news from the nation's capital. I'm your host, Steve Lance, from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow.